Jake Foster's boots squeaked against the polished floor of Station Kepler 442 as he maneuvered his anti-grav cart around a group of arguing merchants. The cart wobbled slightly under the weight of today's deliveries, threatening to tip over every time he took a corner too fast. He'd been doing this job for 8 months now, and honestly it was getting pretty boring. Same routes, same faces, same complaints about late packages. At 23 years old, Jake wasn't exactly living his dream. Back on Earth, his mom always said he'd do something important one day. Well, here he was, surrounded by thousands of alien species from across the galaxy, and he was still just a guy pushing boxes around. Galactic Express didn't pay much, barely enough to cover his tiny apartment in the human quarter, but at least it kept food on the table. Real food too, not the synthetic stuff some of his friends survived on. The morning had been typical. A power cell delivery to a Velen engineer who complained it took too long. Medical supplies for the station infirmary where a nurse with purple skin and way too many fingers signed his datapad. 3 packages of what he assumed were clothes for a family of small furry aliens who chittered excitedly when he arrived. Then came the weird one. Jake glanced down at his datapad again just to make sure he'd read it right. Archival Sector, Keeper Vorith. He'd worked this station for months and never once had a delivery to the archives. Most people didn't even know that section existed. It was tucked away in the older part of the station, where the corridors looked different, almost ancient compared to the shiny modern sections where everyone usually hung out. The crowds thinned as Jake pushed deeper into the station. The bright commercial lights faded to a dimmer, almost greenish glow. Crystalline storage units lined the walls, each one humming softly with whatever data they contained. Everything here felt old, important, like a library back home where people whispered instead of talked. Jake found the door marked with symbols he couldn't read and knocked twice. It slid open with a hiss that sounded like the thing hadn't been opened in years. Keeper Vorith stood waiting, and Jake had to stop himself from staring. The alien was tall, maybe 7 feet, with smooth blue-gray skin and 4 eyes arranged in a diamond pattern on his face. All 4 eyes were currently glaring at Jake with what definitely looked like impatience. "You're late," Vorith said, his voice carrying an accent Jake couldn't place. The Keeper's long fingers snatched the sealed container from Jake's cart before he could even offer it properly. "Sorry, the crowds in the main sector were pretty bad today," Jake offered, though Vorith didn't seem to care about excuses. The alien was already moving toward a pedestal in the center of the room, the container clutched carefully in his hands. Jake should have left right then. Get the signature, move on to the next delivery, finish his shift, grab some food, maybe watch a movie before bed. That was the routine. But something made him stay in the doorway, watching as Vorith opened the container with surprising reverence. Inside was a crystal about the size of Jake's fist, that seemed to glow with its own internal light. Vorith placed it carefully on the pedestal, and immediately the room changed. Holographic symbols burst into existence above the crystal, floating in the air like 3-dimensional ghosts. Jake felt his breath catch. The symbols were beautiful in a strange, uncomfortable way. Geometric patterns that twisted and turned, seeming to shift even when he tried to focus on them. Looking at them too long made his head hurt, made his eyes water, but he couldn't look away. It was like staring at one of those optical illusions that hurt your brain the more you tried to understand it. "What language is that?" Jake heard himself ask, his voice barely above a whisper. Vorith glanced back at him, seeming surprised Jake was still there. "Old Stellar," the Keeper said, turning back to his instruments. "The dead tongue of the Star Kings. Unreadable. Unspeakable. No living being can comprehend it. These symbols have been locked away for 50,000 years, and even now, with all our technology, we cannot translate them. The neural patterns are too complex. The sounds cannot be formed by any known vocal structure." Jake stepped closer without meaning to, drawn by the floating symbols. 50,000 years old. The Star Kings, whoever they were, had been gone since before humans even figured out fire. Before Earth had civilization. And yet, here were their words, still glowing, still waiting. One symbol caught his eye. Unlike the others that seemed to hurt his brain, this one looked almost simple. His mind automatically traced its shape, finding patterns in the lines and curves. It reminded him of something, though he couldn't say what. A shape he recognized somehow, even though he'd never seen it before in his life. Without thinking, without understanding why, Jake read it aloud. The sound that came from his throat didn't feel like his own voice. It resonated deeper, vibrating through his chest, his bones, the air itself. The word, if it was a word, seemed to echo in ways that didn't make physical sense, bouncing off surfaces that weren't there. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then every screen in the archival sector went black. The crystalline storage units stopped humming. The lights flickered and died. And then everything blazed gold. Pure golden light erupted from the crystal, from the symbols, from the walls themselves. It was so bright Jake had to shield his eyes, but he could still see it through his closed eyelids, still feel it warming his skin. Vorith stumbled backward, all four eyes wide with an expression Jake had never seen on any alien's face before. Pure, absolute terror. Impossible, the keeper whispered, his voice shaking. Impossible. You're human. You're just a delivery boy. You didn't just speak. But Jake had spoken. And somewhere deep in the ancient archives, something had heard him. Something that had been waiting 50,000 years for someone to finally say the words correctly. And Jake Foster's boring, unremarkable life as a delivery boy had just ended forever. Jake barely had time to process what happened before the alarms started screaming. Red emergency lights flooded the archival sector, and Keeper Vorith was shouting into his communicator in a language Jake didn't understand. The panic in his voice, though, that was universal. Within 20 minutes, the small archive room was packed. Station security arrived first, their weapons drawn like Jake was some kind of threat. Then came the scholars, rushing in with datapads and scanners, all talking over each other in a dozen different languages. Scientists wheeled in equipment Jake couldn't even begin to identify, machines that beeped and hummed and projected weird lights that made his skin tingle. They all wanted the same thing. They all asked the same question over and over in slightly different ways. Oh. Jake sat in a chair they'd shoved him into, feeling like he was back in the principal's office in high school, except this time the principal was an 8-foot-tall alien with too many limbs and the detention was looking a lot more serious than staying after school. The high scholar arrived an hour later. Corveth was his name, and he was the kind of alien that commanded respect just by walking into a room. He was tall and thin, with dark purple skin that seemed to shimmer under the lights, and his face was set in an expression that probably looked stern even when he was happy. Right now he definitely wasn't happy. "Clear the room," Corveth ordered, and everyone scattered like kids when a teacher shows up. Only Vorith stayed, standing nervously in the corner. Corveth pulled up a chair and sat directly in front of Jake. His eyes, 3 of them arranged in a triangle on his face, studied Jake like he was a puzzle that didn't make any sense. "Do you understand what you've done?" Corveth asked. His voice was quiet, controlled, but Jake could hear the tension underneath it. "Not really," Jake admitted. "I just read a symbol. That's it." "Old Stellar has been dead for 50,000 years, Corveth said slowly, like he was explaining something to a child. "The linguistic structure is so complex that our most advanced neural interfaces burn out trying to translate it. We've had the greatest minds in the galaxy studying these symbols for centuries. Organic vocal systems from any known species cannot produce the sounds. The physics don't work. The biology doesn't work. It's impossible." Jake shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Well, I don't know what to tell you. I just looked at it and it made sense, you know? Like when you look at a stop sign. You don't think about reading it, you just read it." Corveth leaned back, and for the first time, Jake saw something other than sternness in his expression. He saw confusion. Maybe even a little fear. "Show me," Corveth said, pulling out a datapad. He projected more symbols into the air, different from the ones Jake had seen before but similar enough. "Can you read these?" Jake looked at them. His head hurt a little, that same weird pressure behind his eyes, but yeah, he could read them. The sounds just came to him like his brain was automatically processing them into something his mouth could say. He spoke 3 of them aloud. The room's temperature dropped by 10 degrees instantly. Frost formed on the edges of the datapad. Corveth jerked backward so fast he nearly fell out of his chair. "Stop," the scholar shouted. "Don't speak any more." Jake froze, his heart hammering. What just happened? Vorith was pressed against the wall, all 4 of his eyes wide. "Temperature manipulation," he whispered. "You just commanded the thermal energy in the room to disperse." "I what?" Jake looked at his hands like they might have done something without him knowing. For the next 6 hours they ran tests. Brain scans that made Jake's skull feel like it was vibrating. Linguistic analyses where he had to repeat the same sounds over and over while machines recorded every tiny detail. Audio recordings played back at different speeds, frequencies Jake couldn't even hear. They showed him more symbols, hundreds of them, and Jake identified them easily. The sounds were just obvious to him, sitting right there in his brain like they'd always been there. But here was the weird part. He didn't understand what any of them meant. It was like being able to pronounce French perfectly but having no idea what you were actually saying. The sounds made sense, but the meaning was locked away somewhere he couldn't reach. Corveth sat down again after the 6th hour, looking exhausted. Jake felt pretty exhausted himself. His throat hurt from all the talking, and his head was pounding from staring at symbols for so long. "I need to tell you something," Corveth said quietly, glancing at the door like he was making sure no one else could hear. The Star Kings ruled this entire sector of space. Thousands of worlds, billions of beings all under their control. And their language wasn't just communication, Jake. It was power. Jake rubbed his tired eyes. "What do you mean power?" "I mean they spoke and reality changed. They commanded matter and energy through phonetics alone. They could reshape planets with words. Start or stop stars. Create or destroy entire fleets with a sentence. That's why the language died with them. That's why no species should have access to it. That kind of power corrupts everything it touches." The room felt colder now, and it wasn't because Jake had accidentally messed with the temperature. "Then why can I read it?" Corveth looked at him with those three eyes, and Jake saw real fear there. "That," the scholar said softly, "is what terrifies me." By the next morning, news had spread across the galactic network. Jake saw it on the screens in his holding room because they weren't letting him leave. Every news channel was talking about it. The human who spoke Old Stellar. The delivery boy who did the impossible. Humanity, the newest species in the Galactic Coalition, the one everyone saw as kind of cute but not particularly impressive, had just produced someone who could speak the language of gods. Jake watched the news reports, watched alien commentators debate what this meant, watched politicians argue about what should be done with him, and realized with a sinking feeling in his stomach that his quiet life as a delivery boy was over. He couldn't just push a cart around the station anymore. He couldn't just go home to his tiny apartment and watch movies. Everything had changed the moment he opened his mouth. And the scary part? Jake had a feeling this was just the beginning. The secure research facility didn't have bars on the windows, but Jake knew a prison when he saw one. Sure, they called it protective custody. Sure, they gave him a comfortable bed and decent food. But the door only opened when they wanted it to open, and guards stood outside every hour of every day. He'd been there for 3 weeks now. 3 weeks of tests, examinations, and medical procedures that felt like they'd never end. Aliens he'd never met poked at him with instruments, scanned his brain, took samples of his blood, and asked the same questions over and over until Jake wanted to scream. But the worst part wasn't the tests. It was hearing what they said when they thought he couldn't understand them. Jake had learned to recognize certain alien languages by now, at least enough to catch the important words. Some of the scientists wanted to study him like a lab rat. Others talked about using him, about how humanity could become a weapon if properly controlled. And a few, the ones that made Jake's blood run cold, whispered that maybe the easiest solution was to eliminate the problem before it got worse. Before humanity became too dangerous. Jake tried not to think about that last part too much. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Rachel Howard arrived on station with a team of human scientists, and for the first time in weeks, Jake saw a familiar face. Well, not familiar exactly, but human. Someone from Earth who didn't look at him like he was either a miracle or a threat. Dr. Howard was in her 40s, with gray streaks in her dark hair and the kind of tired eyes that came from too many late nights in a lab. She was a cognitive scientist, whatever that meant, and she'd been studying Jake's brain scans from Earth. The Galactic Council called an emergency assembly to hear her findings. Jake sat in the back of the massive council chamber, feeling small among the hundreds of alien representatives. Corveth was there, along with Keeper Vorith and scientists from a dozen different species. Dr. Howard stood at the center podium, looking completely unbothered by the fact that she was addressing some of the most powerful beings in the galaxy. "It's not Jake specifically," she began, her voice echoing through the chamber. "It's how human brains work. We're persistence pattern matchers. It's an evolutionary trait that goes back millions of years." She pulled up holographic displays showing complex brain scans. Jake's brain on one side, various alien brains on the other. "Humans evolved as endurance hunters," Dr. Howard continued. "We didn't have claws or fangs or natural weapons. What we had was the ability to track prey for days, sometimes weeks, by recognizing subtle patterns. A bent blade of grass. A disturbed stone. A faint scent on the wind. Our brains became incredibly good at finding patterns in what looks like randomness." An alien council member interrupted. "What does hunting have to do with speaking Old Stellar?" Dr. Howard smiled slightly. "Everything. We see faces in clouds. We hear words in static. We find constellations in random stars. Our brains don't just recognize patterns, they force patterns onto things that don't have them. It's automatic. We can't turn it off." She zoomed in on the neural scans. "Old Stellar isn't a traditional language. We've confirmed this through extensive analysis. It's mathematical resonance, a pure geometric expression of physical laws. To most species, it appears as impossible noise. Their brains recognize it as corrupted data and reject it immediately. Jake watched as the alien brain scans showed exactly that, neural pathways shutting down when exposed to old stellar symbols. But human brains don't reject it, Dr. Howard said quietly. We see those impossible geometries and our brains say, that's a pattern I can map. We force it into something recognizable. We make the unspeakable speakable. The council chamber fell completely silent. Jake could hear his own heartbeat in the quiet. Corveth stood up slowly. Are you saying any human could do what Jake does? Dr. Howard nodded. Theoretically? Yes. Jake was just the first human to encounter old stellar symbols. Any human exposed to them should be able to process and vocalize them. Some might be better at it than others, just like some people are better at regular languages, but the basic ability is there in all of us. The chamber erupted. Aliens shouting in 100 different languages all at once. Some sounded angry. Others sounded scared. A few just sounded shocked. Jake sat back in his chair and let the weight of it sink in. It wasn't just him. It was all of humanity. Every single human had this ability locked away in their brain, just waiting for the right symbols to unlock it. The implications spread through the galactic community like wildfire over the next few days. Emergency sessions were called. Politicians argued. Military leaders made thinly veiled threats. Should humans be granted access to Star King archives? Should they be restricted from them completely? Should humanity be monitored, controlled, or worse? While the galaxy argued about what to do with his entire species, Jake was allowed to return to studying with Keeper Voreth. The old alien had gotten over his initial terror and now seemed genuinely fascinated. Together, they carefully explored more old stellar texts, with safety protocols in place and scientists monitoring every word. That's when they made the discovery that changed everything. Jake was practicing pronunciation, trying to get the subtle tones right on a particularly difficult symbol. He spoke it aloud, adjusting his voice slightly from the previous attempt. Every object in the lab lifted 3 inches off the table and hung there, suspended. Voreth's datapad floated in front of his face. Jake's water bottle drifted past his head. The pens, the equipment, everything just hung in the air, defying gravity. Stop speaking, Voreth said carefully, and Jake closed his mouth. Everything crashed back down. They looked at each other, and Jake saw his own realization reflected in Voreth's 4 eyes. Old Stellar didn't just describe reality. When spoken correctly, it commanded reality to obey. Jake had just changed the fundamental force of gravity in the room by 0.5%. Just by speaking a single word. And any human could learn to do the same. News of Jake's ability to manipulate gravity spread faster than anyone expected. Within days, the story wasn't just on station news feeds anymore. It was everywhere. Every planet in the Galactic Coalition, every trade route, every backwater colony had heard about the human who could speak words that changed reality. Most people were scared. Some were fascinated. And a few became obsessed. The conformity had existed for thousands of years, scattered groups of aliens who worshipped the memory of the Star Kings. They believed the ancient rulers were gods who would one day return to restore order to the galaxy. Most people dismissed them as harmless religious fanatics, the kind who stood on street corners handing out pamphlets that nobody read. Turns out they weren't so harmless after all. They came for Jake at night. He was asleep in his quarters at the research facility when the door exploded inward. Not unlocked, not hacked, actually exploded. Jake barely had time to sit up in bed before hands grabbed him, strong alien hands that didn't care how roughly they handled him. They threw a hood over his head and something sharp jabbed into his neck. The world got fuzzy around the edges. Jake tried to fight, tried to yell, but his body wasn't responding right. Whatever they'd injected him with made his muscles feel like rubber. He heard shouting, the sound of weapons fire, but it all seemed distant and unimportant. When the hood came off, Jake had no idea how much time had passed. Could have been minutes or hours. His head was clearing slowly, the drug wearing off, and he found himself being dragged through tunnels he'd never seen before. Old tunnels with walls that looked like they'd been there since the station was first built centuries ago. The maintenance passages were narrow and dark, lit only by emergency lights that flickered weakly. Jake stumbled along, held up by 2 aliens whose faces he couldn't see clearly. His captors moved with purpose, like they knew exactly where they were going, through twists and turns that Jake knew he'd never be able to retrace. Finally, they emerged into a chamber that made Jake's breath catch. It was huge, carved directly into the station's original structure, and it was old. Really old. The walls were covered in symbols that made his eyes hurt to look at, symbols he recognized with a sinking feeling in his stomach. Old Stellar. The walls were absolutely covered in it. The leader of the group stepped forward and Jake got his first good look at him. The alien was tall and thin, with gray skin covered in scars that looked ceremonial rather than accidental. His eyes burned with an intensity that made Jake want to back away. "My name is Dreth," the alien said, his voice carrying a strange accent. "And you, Jake Foster, are the herald we have waited generations to find." "I don't know what you're talking about," Jake said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm just a delivery guy. You've got the wrong person." Dreth smiled, and it wasn't a friendly expression. The Star King spoke of one who would come. One who could give voice to their sacred words. "You will awaken our gods and they will return to lead us once more." Jake looked around the chamber at the dozen or so aliens who'd brought him here. They all had that same intense look in their eyes, that same fanatical belief. These weren't people he could reason with. "Look, I can speak some symbols but I don't know what they mean," Jake tried to explain. "I can't just awaken anything. It doesn't work like that." Dreth gestured to the walls. "Speak the words. All of them. Awaken the temple and summon our gods." "I don't even know what would happen if I did that. I could kill us all." Something cold and sharp pressed against Jake's throat. A blade, curved and wicked-looking. Dreth's smile never wavered. "Then I suggest you speak carefully," Dreth said softly. "Because if you refuse you die here. And we will simply find another human to take your place." Dr. Howard was very clear. "Any human can do what you do." Jake's mind raced. If he spoke the words, who knows what would happen. But if he didn't, they'd kill him and grab some other random human off the street to try again. At least if he did this, he might be able to control it somehow. "Okay," Jake said quietly. "Okay, I'll do it. Just put the knife down." Dreth lowered the blade slightly but kept it close. "Begin." Jake looked at the nearest wall and started reading. His voice came out shaky at first, then stronger as he fell into the rhythm of it. The words felt different here, heavier somehow, like they carried more weight than the ones he'd practiced in the lab. The chamber responded immediately. Lights flickered to life along the walls, soft at first, then brighter. Ancient technology that had been dormant for 50,000 years suddenly woke up, responding to sounds it hadn't heard in millennia. Holographic displays materialized out of thin air, showing things Jake couldn't begin to understand. Star maps with constellations he didn't recognize. Technical readouts and symbols and numbers that scrolled past too fast to follow. What looked like weapon systems, their designs so advanced they might as well have been magic. The walls themselves began to glow, pulsing with golden light that seemed to come from deep within the stone. Dreth fell to his knees, tears streaming down his scarred face. The other conformity members started chanting in their own language, voices rising in religious ecstasy. But Jake couldn't stop reading. Something was pulling him forward, drawing his attention to a central pedestal in the middle of the chamber. The symbols there were different, arranged in spiraling patterns that seemed to move even though they were carved in stone. He spoke them aloud, his voice resonating in ways that made his bones vibrate. A message appeared in the air above the pedestal. Not in old stellar this time, but in simple images that transcended language. Pictures that any species could understand, telling a story that made Jake's blood run cold. The Star Kings hadn't died. They'd evolved beyond physical form, transcending into something else entirely. They'd left their language behind deliberately, as a test for whoever came after them. Not a test of strength. Not a test of intelligence or technology. A test of character. They were looking for a species with the perfect balance. Smart enough to understand power but humble enough not to abuse it. Strong enough to persist against impossible odds but wise enough to cooperate instead of conquer. A species that could find meaning in chaos, that could make the impossible possible, that could speak the unspeakable. The images showed other species who tried and failed. Civilizations that had found fragments of old stellar and destroyed themselves with it. Empires that had used it to dominate others and collapsed from within. And now humanity had found it. The test wasn't over, Jake realized with absolute certainty. It was just beginning. And the entire human race was about to be judged on what they did next. The moment Jake spoke those final words in the ancient temple, something changed across the entire galaxy. Not just on Station Kepler 442 but everywhere. Ancient Star King installations that had been dead and silent for 50,000 years suddenly blazed to life. On frozen planets where nobody lived, lights turned on. In abandoned ruins that archaeologists had studied for centuries, machinery hummed back to existence. Deep space monitoring stations picked up energy signatures from 100 different worlds, all activating at exactly the same moment. all responding to Jake's voice. The Galactic Council lost their minds. Within hours, emergency sessions were called. Representatives from every member species flooded into the council chambers, and the debates that followed were unlike anything the galaxy had seen in generations. The chamber that usually ran with orderly procedure descended into absolute chaos. Some species demanded that humanity be placed under strict oversight, treated like children who'd found their parents' weapons. Others wanted Jake detained indefinitely, locked away where he couldn't accidentally trigger anything else. A few of the more aggressive species made thinly veiled threats, suggesting that maybe humanity should be removed from the coalition entirely before they became too dangerous. And 3 species, 3 entire civilizations, threatened to leave the coalition if humans were given any access to Star King technology. Jake sat in the back of that massive chamber, listening to hundreds of aliens argue about his fate. About humanity's fate. About whether his entire species should be trusted or controlled or eliminated as a potential threat. It was surreal. A month ago he'd been worried about making rent. He'd been pushing a cart through crowded corridors, delivering packages, grabbing cheap food from the station vendors, and going home to watch movies in his tiny apartment. His biggest concern had been whether his boss would yell at him for being late. Now he was at the center of galactic politics, and the decisions being made in this room would affect billions of lives. Dr. Rachel Howard sat next to him, the human scientist who'd explained why Jake could do what he did. She'd been quiet through most of the debates, just listening and taking notes. But now she leaned over and asked quietly, "What do you want to do, Jake?" Jake thought about it. Really thought about it. About power and responsibility. About the message he'd seen in the temple, the test the Star Kings had left behind. About what kind of person he wanted to be, and what kind of species humanity wanted to become. "I want to teach," he said finally. Dr. Howard raised an eyebrow. "Teach?" "Yeah. I want to teach people. Show them how this works. Make sure it's not just me." Before Dr. Howard could respond, Jake stood up. His chair scraped loudly against the floor, and the sound somehow cut through all the arguing. The chamber fell silent as hundreds of alien eyes turned to look at the human delivery boy. Jake's heart hammered in his chest, but he forced himself to speak clearly. "I'm not special," he said, his voice carrying across the huge space. "Dr. Howard already explained this. Any human can do what I do. Trying to control me or restrict me or lock me away won't change that fact. There are billions of humans out there, and eventually, one of them will encounter old stellar symbols. Then another. Then another." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Corveth started to stand, probably to object, but Jake kept talking. "So here's what I'm going to do," Jake continued. "I'm publishing everything. The phonetics, the patterns, the basic principles of how old stellar works. I'm putting it out there for free for any human who wants to learn. No restrictions. No gatekeeping." The chamber erupted. Aliens shouting in dozens of languages all at once. Corveth was on his feet now, his 3 eyes blazing with anger. "You'd give every human access to reality-altering power?" the High Scholar demanded. "Do you understand what you're proposing? The chaos? The danger?" Jake waited for the noise to die down a little, then shook his head. "No. I'm not giving anyone power they don't already have. I'm just making sure humanity shares the burden together. If this ability exists in all of us, then we need to carry it together. We need to be responsible together." He looked around the chamber, meeting as many eyes as he could. "We'll prove to the galaxy that we can be trusted with this. Not because one of us is special. Not because I'm some chosen one or prophet. But because all of us, every human, will be held accountable. We'll police ourselves. We'll teach responsibility along with technique. And we'll show you that humanity deserves the trust the Star Kings apparently had in us." The silence that followed was deafening. What came next wasn't easy. Months of debates. Months of negotiations where Jake sat in rooms with diplomats and politicians who were way smarter and more experienced than him. Compromises were made on all sides. Humanity agreed to supervised access to Star King archives. They agreed to share all discoveries openly, no secrets, no hidden research. They agreed to train teachers, not weapons masters, and to establish ethical guidelines that would be enforced strictly. In return, humanity was allowed to study Old Stellar. To learn it. To preserve it. Jake returned to Station Kepler 442 6 months after everything started. The station felt different now but also strangely familiar. He picked up his old delivery routes again and honestly he'd missed it. The simplicity of it. The routine. Pushing his cart through familiar corridors, nodding to the same merchants, delivering packages to people who just needed their stuff. But 3 nights a week, Jake taught classes in the archival sector. Keeper Vorith assisted, the old alien no longer terrified but genuinely fascinated by what they were building together. Slowly, carefully, more humans learned Old Stellar. Not as conquerors preparing for war. Not as power-hungry individuals seeking advantage. But as students, as scholars, as people who understood the weight of what they were learning. They became translators. Bridges between the ancient past and the living present. Helpers who could unlock secrets that had been sealed for 50,000 years and share them with everyone. Jake Foster, the delivery boy who'd accidentally spoken a dead language, realized one morning that he hadn't really changed careers at all. He'd just expanded his route. He was still delivering, just on a much grander scale. Delivering humanity's gift to the galaxy. The ability to find meaning in the impossible. To persist until even dead languages came alive again. To see patterns where others saw only chaos. And maybe, just maybe, proving that the Star Kings had chosen well after all. The test was ongoing. Every day humanity had to prove itself worthy of the trust placed in them. But Jake figured that was okay. Humans were pretty good at persistence. It's what they'd always done best.